So if we can move to the next slide, we're finding that the percent change in church going is almost, startling. And we're wondering, many of us have wondered, what's going on, the reason we often don't have younger worshipers coming to our congregations. There are a number of factors and a number of things that I would suggest that has contributed to this. Number one, I worked at the Board of Discipleship, and over time, we discovered that maybe age-level ministries and pushing people out of the sanctuary where families were no longer worshiping together, on the same pew and all of that, might not have been the best idea. We sent up to children's church because somewhere along the line people decided that children are noisy and we can't worship, we can't pray, or whatever. And they pushed them to the outer limits. Then when they got a little older, they pushed them into youth church. And I've talked to some young people, and they've said that we've asked them, well, okay, when you finally became adult, why didn't you come back? And they said because that was no longer our home. So we're now recommending in my seminary in particular that we look and reevaluate how we do age-level ministries. That's something I was going to talk about at the end, but I need to say it now because we're going to have an abbreviated time. But as we're looking at the unaffiliated and we're looking at the rise in their numbers, it's something that we're not doing that makes church feel like a hostile place for these groups of people. Something that we're not doing, and yet we could have 5 or 6 generations all sitting on the same pew. Next slide. We could have 5 or 6 generations all sitting on the same pew. You look at that, and that looks like a family you might know. Grandma is there, and mama is there, and the daughter is there, and the daughter's got a daughter that she's in high school. All these people might be on the same pew, and yet we're not able to retain them. So something's going on. So let's look at the next slide and look at the generations themselves. I apologize that I'm going to look like I'm maybe on speed or something because our time, will be abbreviated today. But as we look at those generations, 1925 to 1945, I won't ask who's in what generation while we're sitting here today. But 1925 to 1945 is considered the silent generation. And a lot of those people are our 90-year-olds, some who can still come to church, some that we go to visit out in other places, where they may be living, but they're still part of our community here. 1946 to 64, that's my generation, and that's baby boomers, and we had our day. And I really want to say to the boomers in the room, I will ask the boomers to raise your hand, that's my generation. I want to say to the boomers in the room, we have to admit we had our day. We had our time of influence. Then after that, Generation X, which would have been some of the children that may have come from boomers, Generation X, and we'll talk about their characteristics in a minute, but there's 1965 to 1980. It's a short generation. Now, a generation is generally considered the time that it takes for a person to be born and grow up and have the next generation. So in some cultures, a generation might be 12 to 14 years because 12 to 14-year-olds might be having babies. This generation is kind of short because of the way they reckoned it, but the Generation X is there. Millennials, we are almost tired of hearing about them. They were born from 1980 to either 97 or 2000, and they are impacting us because of their numbers. There are as many millennials as there were boomers. And they had to build the kindergartens and all of that for us, and then the millennials come along, and they're a large generation, and the one behind them is just as large. So we're looking for a culture shift that's going to impact the church. Now, how did boomers impact the church? Anybody here? How did boomers impact the church when we came through? How did we impact the church? How did we change the church? Bigger in numbers. You had to do something with us, And so some of the churches that were big in their heyday, it was probably because the boomers were going there. Yeah. But what else did we do to the church? Contemporary worship. The Gen Xers didn't invent contemporary worship. It was disaffected boomers who came up with worship music, candles, soft lights, all the things that are just kind of mainstay in some churches right now. That was boomers. We affected that change. We took people out of the hymn books oftentimes. Now, we might not have put them on screens immediately. That might have been a Gen X kind of a thing. But we changed the style of worship and went from more formalized settings to more intimate settings, because that's what we felt like we needed. So remember, there's 2 generations coming that are bigger than boomers, and we are going to need to watch the church to see how the church will either have to adapt or they may do their own iteration of church as a result of it. Let's look at the next infographic, and then we won't stay there long because we stayed there in the plenary. But we've got just these different looks of people, and they've got a different vibe about them. Moving on to the next slide. As we look at the silent generation, we find that these people are influenced greatly by the Great Depression. My mother was a Depression baby. And for her, she always worries that there will be enough. Things that happen in the culture affect you. She always worries that there will be enough. So putting things away for a rainy day and not being too extravagant. And, so you heard the finance committee talking, didn't you? And a lot of people from that generation were on finance committees or trustees or what have you. Their characteristics are patriotic and loyal, one job, one company. I see some heads nodding out there. One job, one company. They're often called traditionalists, and that's not a pejorative, it's just a description. And they're not known for their national leadership. We didn't have too many presidents come out of this group. We didn't have too many national leaders come out of this group. It kind of like skipped a generation and went to the boomers in many cases. Next slide, if we look at the boomers, and we put a guitar there because we were sex, drugs, and rock and roll. That's kind of, how our generation was characterized. So the wallpaper, what's going on in the background for boomers was Vietnam, Watergate, civil rights protests, human rights issues, drugs, rock and roll, I've already mentioned that, the women's movement, and the manufacturing boom. So boomers felt like they'd have jobs. Boomers felt like they'd have jobs. I live near Detroit, like 2 or 3 hours from Detroit, and I hear these stories about how people didn't worry with college because all you had to do was graduate from high school and go get you a good factory job, and you could build a house, and you could buy your car, and you could raise your children, and you could do all these things. And then, we moved from the Industrial Revolution into digitalization, where everything went to a computer. It was automated. A robot might have put that part on now, and so all of that fell during our lifetime. Characteristic, we are idealistic and we are focused on ourselves, competitive, and questioned all kinds of authority, to include the church. Yes. Yes. And in fact, if there's an authority, we're looking for ways that we can challenge it. That's boomers. That's boomers. So if you've got them in your church, that's what's happening here. Okay, let's go to the next slide and look at Generation X. Their wallpaper is different. Watergate, which comes along with a suspicion of government. Watergate and a suspicion of government is part of theirs. The Challenger exploded while some of those children were watching it on the TV that they rolled into the room because a teacher went up. The teacher was supposed to be giving updates and all of that, and they watched the Challenger missile explode with all those people on it. I had to really do some talking to my children when that happened. The Challenger exploded. The death of factory jobs, which we talked about, starting during the boomer time and really coming to fruition during Gen X's time. They are children of divorce more than ever before up to that time, and they were latchkey children. I remember putting a chain and a key inside the T-shirt because all of us had to go to work. And they were latchkey children. They know Sesame Street, MTV, BET, and the emergence of hip-hop happened during this generation. Now, hip-hop's a strange thing because as I'm looking at the clock there, I'm glad it's right there where I can see it too. I couldn't see with the light in my eyes up there. The emergence of hip-hop is strange because in the black community, every musical art form that emerged prior to that time had its roots in the church. Hip-hop was born out of wedlock. It was outside the church. It just came up out there with no influence and no supervision from the church. And so that's why hip-hop was considered so strange and so threatening, because we're wondering, where's their spiritual roots? Aretha Franklin had spiritual roots. Whitney Houston had spiritual roots. Patti LaBelle had spiritual roots. But when hip-hop came along, where y'all from? So this is one of the reasons. So Generation X, their characteristics: distrustful, cynical, self-reliant, resourceful, adaptive, and they were forced into technology whether they like it or not. I have friends who could not adapt when the computers came, and many of them ended up almost homeless because you had to either learn this technology thing or you weren't going to have a job in a lot of cases, and some people just couldn't. They weren't even wired to think that way. So there's a cynicism that comes with this generation. Let's go to the next one, to millennials. Millennials, their wallpaper is very different, where you had the Great Depression with one group, and you had Vietnam with another group, and you had Watergate with another group. They had Hurricane Katrina when they were just old enough to ask questions about it, They had Hurricane Katrina, they had violence, they had prison and police, they had gangs and drugs. Gangs rose up during their time. Diversity began to get talked about during this generation. 9/11, the mortgage crisis, and the social media boom. No wonder they're different. No wonder they're different. When you look at the wallpaper and see what's in the walls with the people who are growing up, it kind of gives you a clue to why they're going to be different. So their characteristics: they are globally aware, they are technologically savvy, they are realists, and they're concerned about relationships and personal safety. And some of you have millennials living in your basement because they would rather do without and wait for the right job because they've seen us toil over work that we hated. And that's the explanation you can get from many millennials. They would rather wait for the right job than to give all of their lives to something that they absolutely hated to do. And they would rather take a pay cut and have more time off to be with their friends and their family. So they are not driven by the economic systems. And we're finding this next group will even be more so. So characteristics, and we're moving on because our time will be gone before we know it. They're self-confident and they're generally mature. Next slide. Yeah, there we go. They're generally mature, they're relational, and they are family-first people. And so they don't mind not coming to church because they're going to soccer, because family comes first. We taught everybody else that God comes first, but they said, my child and their development and their relationships and so family comes first. They are peacemaker, and their work values, they value a work-life balance. They don't want all that overtime. You can offer it to them, and they'll often turn it down because I would rather go home and spend time with my family or take a nap. So, very different. They want a fun or enjoyable work environment, flexibility, structure, feedback, and a good salary. I can't tell you how many conversations at the campus that I've had with millennials who were getting ready to go in and confront their bosses for more pay and trying to teach them how to talk about that differently, rather than coming and storming in, you don't see my value. It's like, no, they may not see your value. Let's dial it back a little bit. So, next slide. They expect to be married for life, so they're not quick to marry. They expect it, so they're marrying later and they're having their first child later because they expect to be married for life, and they've seen so many of our divorces that they don't want to fall into that river. And so you find them being very cautious in that way. They consider themselves colorblind. They have friends that look like the United Nations. And I have in my household, I have one millennial and I have one Gen Xer. And I would say that is true of both of them. And so you go to meet their friends and you're seeing all these new faces, and they're looking to see what your reaction is going to be to those new faces. So let me just say this now in case I don't get to say it later. When you are hoping to make room in your congregation for this generation, only 13% of them rank spiritual matters important, and only 20% of them will call themselves born again. So when you're trying to make room with them, remember that they were raised in a post-Christian culture. America is no longer a Christian nation. That's been gone for maybe 10, 15, 20 years. We are no longer classified as a Christian nation. And with pluralism and multiple faith groups, Hinduism and Buddhism and Baha'i and other things all around, and having friends in their high school that come from these varying religious traditions that they consider their friend. Their friendship is not defined by whether they're Christian friend or not, but these are my friends who happen to be Buddhist, or this is my friend who happens to be Muslim. And so religious matters pan out differently for them. That's just the way they do it. They pan out differently. They've been marked by history. They have seen natural disasters. They've seen changes in the family structure. They've seen terrorism. We've all seen it for the first time, but while they were coming of age. And so they have a new term for them called GOY, growing older younger. It's down there on the bottom line there. They had to grow up pretty fast. They had to grow up pretty fast.
That's what that means now?
Yeah, I know. No wonder you didn't get it, yeah. Growing older younger. And so when we're looking at all of this, think about how we have envisioned young adult ministry or youth ministry in times past. Would that even work if they were to come? Would that even work with people with this kind of experience and outlook and demeanor now? That means we've got to rethink what young adult ministries look like. We've got to rethink how we even construct a sermon for those of you who are pastors. We have to rethink all of that.
How are you even going to get them in your church?
How are you even going to get them in? I think you have to go out where they are.
Well, that's what I've been doing, but the thing is, I don't know how to drag them back in.
Oh, you may not
do it by myself.
You may not drag them back in. That's the part. Maybe back in is not the place for them. It sounds kind of strange because we always thought just bring them to church. Yeah, and hang out there with them. If that's the only place they're going to get any kind of religious influence, then that's where we meet. We meet on the street corner, we meet in the bar, we meet at Starbucks, we meet at the breakfast place, we meet in homes.
Hey, that's rough if you're going to meet them down where they're at, because I was just in a place where I was the only one not smoking dope. And because I was there to support one of their friends who happened to be my friend. And he needed a ride.
Okay.
The thing is, how do you, and they know me. I mean, they kind of knew why I was there and the whole 9 yards. But the thing is, how do you carry that on and bring God up into that? They don't want to hear a lot of that.
Well,
one guy, he was pretty cool.
But the middle ground would be the Starbucks.
You meet him where there's a place to.
Yeah. The middle ground would be the Starbucks. You might want not go where the dope smokers are, but the middle ground is. Well, you might end up there, but you don't want to stay there. But the middle ground are the public places and public spaces that they see as neutral, because somehow this space has been labeled as toxic. Maybe they heard we were brawling in the streets. Just saying, So coming to neutral space, yes, sir. And we can go to the next 2 slides. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
You have to meet people where they're at, because I've encountered what you were talking about with the Muslims,
Mm-hmm.
Hindus.
Mm-hmm.
The Baha'i religion is very
Yeah, Baha'i is growing.
yeah, in Peoria. So in doing that, you don't have to compromise your
No,
Christian.
I'm still Christian wherever I take me. Wherever I take me.
Because I'll even greet some of them with assalamu alaikum.
Mm-hmm.
But it tears down the wall.
Mm-hmm.
And then they'll say, well, you're different. But I still invite them to church.
Yeah, yeah. And some might come. Some might come. We just looked at a video that I would highly recommend if you haven't seen it, a documentary done by Abigail Disney called Pray the Devil Back to Hell, and it's the story of the Liberian women who stopped the war in Liberia. And they stopped it because the Muslim women and the Christian women got together, and among the Christian women, every manner of Protestant that you can imagine, and Catholic women, all banded together, and they put the pressure on the government, they put the pressure on the UN, they organized, they went in busloads to another country where they were having a peace summit, and demonstrated and did everything in the world they could for months together, because when they tried to protest and say, well, how are we going to do anything with these Muslim women? And a girl stood up in the thing and said, does a bullet know the difference? Does a bullet know the difference between a Christian and a Muslim? So that was the first case study I had seen of interreligious cooperation. And nobody was worried about trying to convert the other. They're just working together trying to stop the war so the children were getting killed like they were getting killed. So we can have religious cooperation, interfaith across boundaries, but wherever I go, I'm still Christian. And everybody knows it, because that would be me. But so learning how to feel that without compromise, and how to have a witness that is not an affront. I'm just a Christian. And if that offends you, you should leave the room too. But I'm not coming here to get in your face. I'm not going to say anything ugly about Muhammad, but I'm just a Christian. So, just there's a Christian in the room. Hey, Christian in the house. So doing that is probably the way to help our young people, because they think this is a toxic place. I see your hand, ma'am. Yes. 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 Yeah. And not talk about it, or to determine that some things are taboo, or when we do talk, we're fighting. It breaks my heart right now. Because if I meet young people, where am I going to send them? We're fighting. You don't want to send people home when your parents are fighting, So young people are finding that they're calling us a toxic environment. Centennials, I'm going to move quickly because I got about 9 minutes before we started coming out. Their wallpaper is the post 9/11 terrorism. They have never known a time when it was safe. I start thinking about school right now. I lived in the ghetto of Kansas City, and I went to a ghetto school that was segregated. It was before integration, because I was born in 1951, and I always thought, if I get to school, I'm safe there. And now school is not a safe place. And so just the angst and the higher suicide rates that are coming along, and a lot of other things that are coming along with them not having any safe place at all. They knew the mortgage crisis and the economic crisis. A lot of their parents lost their homes in 2008. They know all of this as their childhood. And so how do we do ministries with young people who have been through this? It's not duck, duck, goose. We've got to come up with other ways of approaching young people, because they know too much. They grew up younger. They knew prison and drug violence. They knew global warming, and they remember having a black president, and they remember when the legislation was done legalizing gay marriage. So some of them are having the hardest time understanding what the church is doing right now, because it's legal, So they don't understand what we're doing. And so being able to be in dialogue with young people whose wallpaper looks like this, then their characteristics, they are self-aware. They understand their feelings, they understand their gifts, they understand, and they're confident. You saw all those 12 and 14-year-olds with those businesses that are making millions of dollars that they came up with, me and the bees, an 11-year-old in Whole Foods. Where does that come from? So what does the church offer them? We offer them Jesus. But what do we offer them for the living of their days? Because after we've come to a knowledge of Christ that brings us into the family of God, the rest of our lives are spent with sanctifying grace, as Wesley would have called. So I know how to live a good life with everything that comes my way. And we may not always be talking about that. And so when they're coming to look for help on how do I live this day, give me the tools to make those decisions, because they're going to be on the fly sometimes. We may not be equipping them the way they need. So learning how to do decision making and so forth. They are true digital natives. They have never known a time when they were not on a machine. My grandchildren are, I've got one that's a junior in high school and one that's a sophomore in college. And when they were 4 years old, their daddy bought each of them their own computer. They have never known a time not on screen. Now, my son also works for a big tech company, but, they've never known a time they're not on screen. They live in and they're informed by the newly created worlds of cyberspace, social media, and here's the big thing. They are ethnically diverse. Generation Z, or the Centennials, are 55% white, 24% Hispanic, and 14% African American. And so in the next slide, you'll see this is a census that they've been doing of 5-year-olds going into kindergarten. And we see here that the diversity of the kids going into kindergarten has reached 50%. So half the kids going into kindergarten are non-white. So they always know diversity. All their friends are different. And because of religious pluralism, all of their friends may not be Christian. So we've got some different stuff going on here. I'm going to skip the next several slides because I'm looking at 423 and a church service coming in here. But there are some hair-splitting differences between the millennials and the generation edgers that come here. One of which, millennials are more entitled. They feel like they were the ones that always got a gold star and always heard, good job, So they feel like they are deserved affirmation. But the other group, the centennials coming behind them, are the kids that are going to roll up their sleeves and try to make it happen. They're going to shake it up and wake it up and try to make it happen. If we go to the biblical example slide, if we go down to the biblical example slide, we find that this is not the first time young people have quaked our world and shaken us up. We had Daniel and the 3 young men. We had Esther, who was a younger woman. We have King David, who was a boy with a slingshot. And if I had time, I'd love to talk about how he wasn't just a little boy with a yo-yo or something, a toy. He knew what to do with that slingshot. He was sent out there with the sheep and the lion and the bears and all that are out there, and the wolves and so forth and so on. He knew how to handle his business with the slingshot here. So he wasn't a lucky kid who got in a lucky shot. He'd been trained to pop that thing so he could take care of his flock there, even though he was a kid. So kids had more responsibility in other times. Mary of Nazareth may have been as young as 14. Mary, mother of Jesus, might have been as young as 14. That's a big decision to pop with a 14-year-old. Will you take the stigma of saying that you're having a baby out of, will you take the stigma? And then, not knowing if Joseph is going to put her away quietly, get her stoned or whatever, I can do it. No word from God is impossible in the Greek, and I took Greek and Hebrew for a while. No word from God shall be without power. God's got the power to bring it, and I'm there. That's a big decision for a 14-year-old. And then Josiah, who brought the nation back to revival. He was a boy. He was a young boy. So we've seen young people as prime actors in theology, and we've seen them in the Bible. Let's skip ahead. We're going to go past the innovators and the children entrepreneurs because we looked at them in the plenary. And I want to go to the slide that says mismatched. They see that our slip is hanging. Can I use that metaphor? They see a broken system that needs fixing, and we have that broken system. They have technological platform, and we are limited or limping technologically. How many churches are, when you started filing your reports electronically, how much flap went on? You know, we are struggling. We are mismatched. They have access to information, and in our churches, we offer limited access to information or leadership. They are used to having information at the drop of a fingertip. And we hold back information because knowledge is power. And so we find that just some of our ways are alienating. So let's go to the stop sign. Stop some of this age-level ministry segregation, putting the children out. And now we'll dismiss the children. Jesus loves the little children. I got a business. You know, we got to stop some of this. It's madness. They were a feature of the 20th century as we were trying to figure out how to deal with our times. It didn't work then. It won't work now. So think of ways to do intergenerationally. Just like these nuns, these were millennials and Gen X's, they were going to the monastery to learn from the nuns. They want to hear what old people say. Old people are not the enemy for these two youngest generations. They are wisdom that I want to tap into and get to know about. Let's go to the next slide where the children are singing loudly. Another place where intergenerational ministry makes sense is worship and celebration. So having young people vitally involved in worship, in the actual reading of the scripture, teach them biblical storytelling. Look for the network of biblical storytellers online. It's a whole underground group of people who are coming who perform the word so that we can hear it and understand it. Getting young people involved in worship makes a lot of sense. And then go to the next slide. Another place where intergenerational ministry makes sense is in serving. I was moved to tears. I'm almost there. I'm watching my brother. I was moved to tears by the testimony of one of my students. One of my students has little children. She's got about 3 or 4 little children, and she was studying for ministry. And she said, we don't have much, but my children and I make peanut butter and jelly sandwiches, and we go out to the park where the homeless are, and we together distribute those sandwiches. We got a day every week, where we go and do that. Because she said, I want them to know their responsibility for the poor while they are yet children. So serving is an intergenerational responsibility for ministry. And then finally, the next slide, teaching, learning ministries, opportunities for intergenerational ministry. Final slide here. Resist the urge to try to entertain. They don't want to be entertained. Gen X might have wanted to be entertained. Boomers might have wanted some entertainment, but they don't want to be entertained. Think of ways to bring them into ministry with you. I am where I am today because I had a teacher who took me out on the road with her when she was doing public speaking, and she got permission from my parents to put me in the car and take me around on her round. She was a civil rights worker. And I am where I am today because she just come go with me. Now, you get up and say it. And she would sit back and let me make the campaign speeches when we were trying to get our first black senator in Oklahoma. She said, and I was so little they had to put me on a soapbox. So apprentice our young people and then get out of their way. They are capable. They are self-aware. They can get information that you'll still be looking for 2 weeks from now. Let them lead, even if it's not the way that you lead. Because if we do not make room, they will certainly be gone. We lost one generation. We lost X. Millennials are looking at us, and this has been declared toxic environment. And centennials are saying, maybe we can do our own church. I wish we had time to talk about what that looks like now. We're at a crucial moment. We're at a crossroads. And if we don't act now, somebody else will take the ball from us, and we'll just die off. Lord, thank you for these who have come to this workshop. We pray, oh God, that somehow something was said or done or projected that will make a difference. And we are praying for 2 at-risk generations that we might be up to the task. In Jesus' name, amen.